Welcome to An Author's Voice, where I'll discuss the craft behind writing and illustrate the points with my own work or discuss other well-known examples. Chapter endings as contracts. A chapter ending is a contract. Most writers sign it without reading. Every working writer has had this talk with a beta reader. The pacing felt off in the middle, they say. You ask which chapter. They can't point to one. So you go back and revise the chapters in that range. You tighten the prose and sharpen the scenes. A month later, the same reader hands you the same note. The pacing still feels off. Same wave at the middle of the book. Same blank look when you ask which chapter. You start to wonder if the reader is just unreliable. They're not. You're looking at the wrong level. Two things here. First, names for the 7 contracts you can sign at a chapter ending. Most writers know 2 of them. They sign the other 5 by accident. Second, why most pacing problems hide in the joints between chapters, where no amount of chapter-level fixing will reach them. What the usual advice gets right. The advice books aren't wrong about chapter endings. End on conflict. End where the reader wants to know what happens next. Don't fizzle out, that's all good. Chapter endings matter. A chapter that ends limp drains the reader's momentum, and a writer who never thinks about endings is making a real mistake. The usual advice is trying to stop that mistake, and it works for writers who haven't noticed that endings are a thing. But the advice is too blunt. It takes a whole category, the chapter ending, and shrinks it down to one trick, the cliffhanger. The words are too rough to describe what's really going on. Think about 2 chapters. One ends on a quiet kitchen at 3 in the morning. The other ends mid-sentence with a gun coming up. Those endings do completely different jobs. They make completely different promises to the reader. They ask completely different things from the next chapter. The usual advice treats both as the same move, end strong, when the kind of ending you choose matters as much as landing it well. So the real question is which hook you're using, and whether the next chapter knows which one you offered. The 7 contracts. These are the 7 I keep coming back to. They're not the full list. A couple more wait in the wings. But these 7 carry the weight. They show up in real fiction often enough to earn names. Each one gets a short pattern, an example, and a note on what it asks the next chapter to deliver. The cliffhanger promises fast resolution. He raised the gun. It tells the next chapter to pick up the same moment, the same people mid-scene, and keep going. Jump ahead in time or switch to a new point of view, and the reader feels cheated. The cliffhanger gets the most attention in advice books, and it gets treated as the default. It's actually one of the stiffest contracts you can sign because it allows the fewest legal moves in response. The reveal promises that someone will deal with a new truth. And then she realized he'd been lying the whole time. The next chapter has to wrestle with what got revealed. We need to see it in the character's head, in how they act, in the relationships it shakes. The reveal has to sink in on the page. If the next chapter drops it and opens on some other errand, the reader feels a loose thread where a landed beat should be. The decision promises a choice playing out. He picked up the phone. The next chapter has to show what the choice sets off. We watch the character commit, so now the world has to answer. Skip past it and never come back, and the choice turns out not to matter. The reader can feel that. The landing promises a beat of rest. She sat in the kitchen and waited for the kettle. The next chapter honors the rest by giving the reader a clean place to start again. Of all 7, this one is the most relaxed about jumps in time, place, or point of view. The landing is your signal that the chapter is done. The reader can set the book down here. The next chapter is free to open in a new room, on a new day, with a new character, because the landing already paid off what came before. The horizon promises an answer later, not now. She didn't know yet, but she would. The next chapter has to hold off on answering. The horizon builds patience. The reader agrees to carry the question for a while, and you've promised the wait will be worth it. Answer too fast and the horizon feels cheap, like you grabbed the move without meaning to honor the delay. The pivot promises a clean shift. 3 weeks later, or a hard cut to a new point of view, a new place, a new mood. The next chapter has to deliver the shift the pivot promised. The shift is the whole point. The next chapter has to feel clearly different enough that the jump reads as a plan and not a whim. The bombshell promises new stakes. And then she said the words that would unmake him. The next chapter has to live in a world where those new stakes are real and felt. The reveal is about information. The bombshell is about fallout. The world has changed, and the next chapter has to show the change. Treat a bombshell like a reveal, with characters who talk it over while everything around them stays the same, and you've broken the promise. The reader was told the ground would shift, and you handed them a conversation. Most writers reach for the cliffhanger and the landing, the two that get all the press. Reveal, decision, horizon, pivot, and bombshell get used by accident, often well, sometimes badly, rarely with the writer knowing which one they just signed. Naming them is step 1 toward signing them on purpose. Step 2 is reading the joints, the joint test. Here's the idea that does the most work. Momentum lives in the joints between chapters. A chapter is a piece. The joint is the handoff. Most pacing problems your readers feel live in that handoff, and that's why fixing the chapter keeps missing them. The test is simple. When you finish a chapter, name the contract it signs, one of the 7. When you start the next chapter, name the contract you're carrying over from the last one. Then ask, does this opening keep that promise or break it? The common mismatches each have a feel you can learn to spot. A cliffhanger followed by a pivot feels like betrayal. You promised fast resolution and gave a jump in time or point of view instead. The danger hangs there, unfinished, while the new chapter asks the reader to care about something fresh. The reader can feel the unpaid debt you're pretending isn't there. A landing followed by a bombshell feels like whiplash. The reader settled in for a breath, and you set off an explosion. The promise said, clean restart. The chapter delivered a jolt they hadn't braced for. The jolt might be the right beat for the story, but you planted it at the wrong joint, and the emotional curve snaps. A reveal followed by an unrelated chapter feels like a dropped ball. The truth landed. Nothing came of it. The next chapter wandered off. The reader reads the silence one of 2 ways: a writer who lost the thread, or a reveal that wasn't worth keeping. Either way, the promise broke on the very first line of the next chapter, before any sentence work could save it. A horizon followed by a fast answer is the flip side. You signaled patience, then asked for none. The question wasn't worth raising. The wait was for show. A decision followed by nothing is the quietest failure and one of the most common. The character chose. Nothing happened. The reader watched a commitment, and the world shrugged. Do that 2 or 3 times in a book, and the reader stops trusting that anyone's choices matter. That's a far bigger problem than one weak joint. The fix is rarely inside the chapter. It's almost always at the joint. Add a short bridge that carries the promise across. Reorder chapters so the handoff makes sense, or change the contract on the closing chapter, because sometimes the chapter is signing the wrong promise for what comes next. The habit, in revision, name the contract at every chapter break before you touch a single sentence inside a chapter. Most sentence work waits downstream of joint work, and most sentence work you do before checking the joints gets wasted. Where it gets tricky, a mismatch on purpose can be great. A cliffhanger followed by a pivot can gut the reader when you know what you're doing. Their hunger for fast resolution becomes the engine the pivot runs on. The contract idea is a tool, and you're allowed to break it. Every contract has a planned violation that, in the right hands, becomes the best move in the chapter. The trick is breaking the promise on purpose. there are at least 2 more contracts that didn't make the 7. The Mirror, where a chapter ends on a beat that echoes its opening and closes a loop. The Lyrical Close, where a chapter ends on a tone the next chapter has to match or break with intent. Both are real, but they're special cases. Most writers won't need the words unless they work in literary fiction or in ambitious genre work where the prose tone itself is part of the promise. Genre sets the baseline, too. Thrillers expect cliffhangers at most breaks. Literary fiction allows more landings. Romance often runs on decisions and bombshells. Writing with your genre or against it is a choice you should make on purpose. Name the contract first. Then decide whether to honor the genre. Doing both on purpose is what separates a book that knows what it's doing from one that hopes you won't notice. The takeaway. A chapter ending is a contract, and most writers have been signing blind. Naming the contract is what turns accidental momentum into craft. The 7 contracts give you the words. The joint test gives you the steps. Together they let you read your own book the way a careful reader does. At the seams, where momentum builds or quietly leaks away. When you end a chapter, name the contract before you write the ending. When you start the next one, name the contract you're carrying in. Watch for the times they don't match. Those mismatches are almost always where the pacing trouble lives. On your next revision pass, run the joint test on every chapter break before you touch any prose. Write down the contract on each closing chapter. Write down the contract on each opening. Mark the mismatches. Most of those marks will land right where your beta readers felt the pacing sag, and the fix will be at the joint, not the chapter, in a spot no amount of sentence polishing was ever going to reach. Thanks for listening to this episode. If you'd like to hear or read more of this sort of thing, subscribe to my email list and follow me on social media using the link below, or search online for Charlie Forit, and you will likely find me. Until next time, thanks for following along. Voices for this recording provided by Speechify. All content written by Charlie Forit. Any opinions expressed in this recording are solely the author's. Learn more at charlieforet.com.